They called it the Island of Death, long before the bodies began to rot in the jungle. For the men of Japan's Imperial Army who landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, it was supposed to be another easy conquest, one more step in an empire that had stretched across the Pacific. Instead, it became the place where hunger turned soldiers into ghosts. When Japanese troops first arrived, they marched through thick, wet air filled with the hum of insects and the smell of rotting leaves. The jungle closed around them like a trap. They did not know that thousands of American Marines had already taken the airfield they were supposed to protect. That airfield, called Henderson Field, became the heart of everything. Whoever held it controlled the sky. And once the Americans began flying from there, every Japanese supply ship trying to reach the island became a floating target. The sea that was supposed to feed the Japanese garrison turned into a graveyard. Day after day, American planes swooped down from Henderson Field, bombing and strafing the cargo ships that tried to sneak in at night. The soldiers on the island began to count days by the sound of explosions. At first, they thought the supply boats would make it through eventually. They never did. Each wreck meant fewer bags of rice, fewer bullets, fewer chances to survive. In Tokyo, commanders promised that reinforcements were coming. They called the nightly destroyer runs the Tokyo Express, fast ships racing through the darkness to bring food and ammunition. But the Express carried more men than rations. The new arrivals stepped off the boats hungry and joined the others in their slow starvation. By the end of the year, the once proud regiments that had charged across Asia were sharing handfuls of mouldy rice and scraping bark from trees. Disease came next. The heat and rain turned every scratch into an infection. Malaria spread through the camps like wildfire. Dysentery weakened the strongest men until they could no longer walk. At night, the jungle buzzed with the sound of mosquitoes and the quiet coughing of soldiers too weak to rise. The smell of unburied corpses drifted through the trees. Even when they found food, it was often spoiled or crawling with insects. Some soldiers tried to fish along the shore, but American patrol boats fired on them. Others dug for roots or chewed grass just to fool their stomachs. Letters written home never mentioned the hunger directly. They spoke in circles, saying only that rations were thin, that spirits were strong, that the emperor would be proud. But in private diaries, the truth spilled out. Men described the ache that never left their bellies, the dizziness that came when they stood too fast, the fear that the next sunrise might be their last. By January 1943, the jungle was filled with the dying. Out of more than 30,000 Japanese troops sent to Guadalcanal, only a fraction could still fight. The rest waited for rescue that would come too late. For them, the island was not just a battlefield. It was a slow descent into hunger, sickness, and madness. And as the weeks dragged on, one question haunted every starving man. When the food ran out completely, what would they become? When the Japanese army first looked at Guadalcanal, it seemed like a small problem in a big ocean. A speck of jungle, 600 square miles of swamp and hills, not worth the fear it would soon inspire. In August 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy still ruled most of the Pacific. Its admirals believed that their soldiers, hardened by years of victory, could crush any enemy. The plan was simple. Land, seize the airfield the Americans had built, push them into the sea, and turn the island into a forward base. They had done it before. They expected to do it again. The orders came from Tokyo to the 17th Army, a force meant to restore Japanese control. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi and later Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake were told that the mission was clear and honorable. They were to retake Henderson Field, a single runway carved into the jungle, and secure it for Japan. The men chosen for the job were veterans of campaigns in China, men who had fought in the steaming jungles of Malaya and Borneo. They carried rifles, bayonets, and an unshakable belief that their emperor's cause could not fail. In the early days, confidence filled every campfire conversation. Officers spoke of quick victory. The Americans were said to be soft, untested, too far from home to endure the jungle. Japanese troops landed along the northern coast at night, silent and sure. They dug into the wet earth, prepared to strike. The jungle was thick, but they believed discipline would carry them through. They had no idea that the airfield ahead of them was already guarded by an enemy that had tasted victory and was not about to let it go. Henderson Field, sitting on a narrow strip of flat land, became the center of the war. American planes took off from it each morning to hunt Japanese ships and troops. For every crate of supplies the Japanese tried to land, American pilots turned two to ashes. Still, Tokyo ordered more men in. The 17th Army swelled to over 30,000 soldiers, but the island swallowed them faster than Japan could send them. Each landing came with fewer rations and less fuel. Soldiers began to notice the pattern. The more men who arrived, the less food there was for everyone. The attacks that followed were brave but doomed. At the Battle of Bloody Ridge in September 1942, Kawaguchi's troops charged through the darkness against entrenched Marines. Machine guns cut through them. Those who survived melted back into the jungle, their faith shaken. More assaults followed, each one ending the same way. The Japanese soldiers fought with bayonets when their rifles ran dry, and when those broke, they fought with their hands. But courage could not overcome hunger or air power. By the end of the year, the proud 17th Army had become a starving shadow of itself. The jungle that was supposed to hide them became their enemy. Malaria thinned their ranks, and the wounded were left behind in makeshift shelters of palm leaves. Of the 36,000 men who had landed with such faith, barely a third would survive to see evacuation. The mission that began with dreams of glory ended in silence, broken only by the distant hum of American planes circling over the island they would never reclaim. The heartbeat of Guadalcanal was a single strip of dirt and crushed coral called Henderson Field. To the Americans, it was the key to holding the island. To the Japanese, it was the reason they were starving. Every bomb dropped, every ship sunk, every man who went hungry was tied to that airfield. When it became operational in August 1942, it gave the United States something Japan had not expected so soon: control of the sky. The Marines who built and defended it called themselves the Cactus Air Force, named after the island's code word, and from the moment they began flying, the Pacific around Guadalcanal belonged to them. The Japanese Navy had been used to ruling these waters. Before Guadalcanal, its destroyers and transports moved without fear. But once American fighters and bombers began launching from Henderson Field, daylight over the Solomon Sea became deadly. Japanese supply ships could no longer approach the island under the sun. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force flew almost non-stop, using worn-out planes patched together with scrap metal. They slept in tents, ate cold rations, and flew missions so often that some called the field the Strip of Death, yet they kept the skies locked. Every morning, the rumble of engines rolled across the jungle. Grumman Wildcats, Douglas Dauntless bombers, and Bell Aerocobras took off in waves, hunting for the thin grey lines of Japanese ships against the blue sea. When they spotted them, they dove through gunfire, dropping bombs that shattered decks and sent plumes of smoke rising into the clouds. For the Japanese, it was like trying to feed an army while sharks circled the waters. Supply ships tried to slip through, but were almost always caught. The wreckage of burning transports littered the coastline, black smoke curling above the trees like warning flags. To avoid destruction, the Japanese changed their tactics. They began sailing only at night, relying on speed and darkness to reach their starving troops. American pilots called it the Tokyo Express. Destroyers raced down the slot, the narrow sea lane between the islands, their decks stacked with crates of rice and ammunition, but the fast runs left little time to unload. When dawn approached, the ships had to flee before the Cactus Air Force returned. Many drums of food and fuel were simply dumped into the sea, expected to drift ashore. Most never did. Inside the jungle, Japanese soldiers waited for those supplies that rarely came. They watched the sky by day, knowing that the same roar of engines keeping them trapped was keeping their enemy strong. Henderson Field never slept. Mechanics worked through the night under blackout lamps, repairing bullet-riddled planes with salvaged parts. Pilots woke before dawn, their faces drawn, their uniforms soaked with sweat. Each mission meant fewer Japanese supplies, and each destroyed transport meant hundreds more men left to starve. By the end of 1942, the airfield that Japan had once dismissed as a small target had become their nightmare. Henderson Field strangled their lifeline, turning the sea into a barrier instead of a bridge. The Cactus Air Force, with its patchwork planes and exhausted crews, had achieved something no fleet or army could. It had turned the sky into a weapon, and in doing so, it had doomed every hungry soldier waiting beyond the tree line, staring at an empty horizon where help would never come. They called it the Tokyo Express, a name that sounded almost proud, like a train that always arrived on time. But there was nothing reliable about those midnight destroyer runs that raced down the narrow channel known as the Slot toward Guadalcanal. After the skies became too dangerous for daytime convoys, Japan relied on these night missions to feed its stranded army. Sleek warships that once carried torpedoes now carried sacks of rice, medicine, and crates of ammunition stacked high on deck. The crews worked under starlight, engines roaring, knowing that if dawn came before they were gone, American planes from Henderson Field would find them and burn them where they floated. The first run seemed bold and clever. The destroyers moved fast, hugging the coastline and darting in and out of darkness. When they reached the island, they dropped anchor for only a few minutes, unloading supplies by hand or pushing cargo into small boats that rowed toward shore. The soldiers waiting on the beaches cheered when they saw the faint silhouettes appear across the water. For a moment, hope felt real, but the cargo was never enough. The Tokyo Express brought men more often than food, and each new arrival only deepened the hunger inland. As the months passed, the Japanese High Command looked for faster ways to deliver supplies. They came up with a desperate plan known as the drum method. Instead of unloading, the destroyers would lash hundreds of metal drums filled with food, fuel, and medicine together in floating chains. The drums would be shoved overboard miles from shore, where currents were supposed to carry them to the beaches. Soldiers, waiting in the surf, would reel them in with ropes and hooks. On paper, it sounded ingenious. In reality, it was chaos. The sea around Guadalcanal was cruel. Many of the drums leaked or split open the moment they hit the water. Others drifted the wrong way, vanishing into the dark. American aircraft often spotted them by sunrise, their pilots diving low to strafe the helpless soldiers trying to pull them in. The water turned white with splashes, and the men scattered for cover as the supplies sank beneath the waves. After each run, fewer drums reached shore. The ones that did were often filled with seawater instead of rice. For the Japanese troops hiding in the jungle, every failed delivery meant another night of hunger. They learned to listen for the sound of engines at sea, praying it meant food was coming. Sometimes they watched from the trees as distant flashes lit the horizon, knowing it was the express being hunted again. The men spoke of the sea as if it were alive, a cruel master that gave and took without reason. Some even risked swimming out at dawn to search for stray drums, but most drowned before they reached them. By the end of 1942, the Tokyo Express had become a symbol of futility. Each run cost ships, fuel, and men, yet the starving soldiers on Guadalcanal received almost nothing. The empire that once conquered half the Pacific now fought to deliver a handful of rice across a few miles of ocean. The express that was meant to save them instead became a ghost train, speeding through the night with no passengers and no promise of survival. The jungle on Guadalcanal did not need bullets to kill. It had its own weapons, quieter and far more patient. The rain never stopped, soaking uniforms until they clung to skin like rags. Mosquitoes swarmed day and night, their hum a warning of fever to come. By October 1942, the Japanese soldiers who had once marched in perfect order now stumbled through the mud, their bodies wasting away faster than they could fight. Hunger hollowed their faces, but disease finished what starvation began. Malaria struck first. Men who had carried rifles through China and Burma now shook uncontrollably under thin blankets, their bodies burning one moment and freezing the next. Dysentery followed, spreading through the camps as clean water ran out. The soldiers dug shallow pits for latrines, but rain filled them, spreading filth through their trenches. Even small wounds festered into open sores. Skin peeled, eyes sunk deep, and the smell of infection hung heavy in the air. Those who could still move dragged the sick onto mats of palm leaves, but there was little medicine and even less strength to care for them. Allied troops who found abandoned Japanese camps later described scenes of horror. Skeleton-thin men lay curled beside empty tins, their uniforms stiff with mud. Some had tried to eat grass or roots, their hands still clutching handfuls of green. American patrols came across bodies sitting upright against trees, rifles across their knees, dead for days. One Marine wrote that the jungle itself seemed to feed on them. The plants grew thick around the corpses, vines wrapping through the bones. By November, Japanese doctors estimated that half their men were too weak to stand. Of the 30,000 soldiers still on the island, fewer than 5,000 could fight. The rest lay hidden in the trees, unable to move or speak. When supplies did arrive, fights broke out over scraps of rice or hard biscuits. Officers tried to maintain order, but discipline meant little to men who had not eaten properly in weeks. Many drank swamp water despite the risk, their bodies too desperate to care. The sound of coughing echoed through the jungle like distant gunfire. The Americans suffered from malaria too, but they had quinine, better rations, and clean medical stations near Henderson Field. For the Japanese, there was nothing. Letters found after the war told the story in short, broken sentences. One soldier wrote, "We can no longer fight. We can no longer dig. The jungle is stronger than the army." Another described burying his friend under a shallow mound of leaves before collapsing beside him. By late December, more Japanese soldiers were dying of disease and starvation than from bullets or bombs. The 17th Army, once a proud force, was now little more than a collection of dying men scattered through the trees. Malaria, dysentery, and hunger had done what the Marines could not. They had broken an army without a single shot. When American patrols moved deeper into the jungle, they sometimes found men still breathing, too weak to raise their hands in surrender. Their eyes were open, staring past the living, already halfway gone. The empire that had promised them glory had left them to rot on an island that smelled of death and decay, where the jungle itself became the final victor. Deep in the jungle of Guadalcanal, far from the airfield that ruled their fate, the Japanese soldiers began to disappear into silence. The perimeter, once marked by patrols and shouted orders, had dissolved into a wilderness of lost men. Inside it, the war shrank to something personal. Hunger ruled every thought. The few diaries that survived tell a story more haunting than any battle report. Kashichi Yoshida, a private of the 17th Army, wrote a short poem in his notebook before dying of starvation. Grass in my mouth, roots in my hands, I cannot remember the taste of rice. His words capture what it felt like to fade in a place where even memory starved. The diaries all speak of food first. The men recorded how each day's ration grew smaller until there was nothing left to measure. Some boiled strips of leather from their boots. Others chewed palm bark, spitting out the fibers when their mouths bled. They called it the diet of ghosts. One soldier described mixing mud with a few grains of rice just to trick his stomach into thinking it was full. The weak were carried for a time, then left under trees when they could no longer walk. In the rain-soaked dark, no one had the strength to bury the dead. Officers tried to hold formations together, but discipline meant little to men who had not eaten in days. Arguments over scraps turned violent. A few men slipped away at night, hoping to find food near the coast. Most never returned. The jungle swallowed them whole. In one diary found after the war, a corporal wrote, "We are now like animals. Each man waits for the other to die." His handwriting stopped halfway through the next line. Despair grew heavier than their rifles. Soldiers began to speak openly of death as relief. Some believed that suicide would cleanse their shame. One man wrote that he dreamed of home every night, but each time he woke, the smell of rot and the drone of mosquitoes brought him back. He ended his final entry with the words, "Tell my mother I fought with honor, even against hunger." He was never identified. Rations, when they appeared, often vanished before reaching the front lines. A handful of officers were accused of hoarding food for themselves, but by then, no one cared enough to punish them. The chain of command had rotted away like everything else. Letters from Tokyo stopped coming. The men began to believe they had been forgotten, abandoned on an island that was no longer part of the empire they served. By January 1943, the few who still kept diaries wrote less about the enemy and more about the earth itself. They described how the jungle seemed to breathe around them, how the rain turned their shelters into graves. Some wrote prayers, others curses, and a few simply listed what they had eaten that day: grass, bark, insects. The last pages of Kashichi Yoshida's notebook were water-stained and unreadable. Only the final line remained clear: "I will sleep, and when I wake, may there be rice." He never woke. By the winter of 1942, starvation on Guadalcanal had reached its cruelest depth. The jungle floor was littered with bones, the air filled with the smell of death. Men too weak to lift their rifles crawled toward puddles for water. Some died mid-step, their faces pressed into the mud. It is from this darkness that the most disturbing rumors began to spread, whispers that Japanese soldiers had turned on each other in the final days. Cannibalism, a word so shocking that even decades later, it feels impossible to say aloud without hesitation. Yet to understand Guadalcanal, one must face the question carefully, separating fact from fear. There is no doubt that starvation consumed the Japanese 17th Army. Diaries, Allied reports, and post-war accounts confirm that thousands died not from bullets, but from hunger. But when it comes to cannibalism on Guadalcanal, the evidence becomes fragile. Some American patrols who searched abandoned camps claimed to have found remains that looked cut or burned. Others said they found human bones among cooking fires. Yet none of these reports were verified by photographs or detailed autopsies at the time. In the chaos of war, rumors traveled faster than truth. What history does record beyond doubt is that cannibalism did occur in other Pacific campaigns. In New Guinea, captured Japanese soldiers later admitted to consuming the dead, both their own and enemy soldiers, when supplies ran out. The Chichijima incident in 1944 even led to war crimes trials after the war. In those places, the evidence was clear, written in testimony and confirmed by multiple witnesses. Guadalcanal, however, remains uncertain. Starvation was real, but whether it crossed that final boundary is something history cannot say with confidence. For the men trapped in that jungle, the thought of such acts may not have been distant. Hunger changes the mind. Soldiers who once quoted poetry began to speak to the dead, to dig for roots with trembling hands. Some historians suggest that small, isolated cases might have happened, born from madness rather than malice. Others argue that the human body fails before it allows such a choice. The truth may lie somewhere in between, buried under decades of silence and shame. Japanese survivors who were evacuated in early 1943 rarely spoke of those final weeks. When asked, they described hunger so fierce that they chewed on grass and bark until their gums bled. One survivor told a journalist in the 1960s, "We thought of eating anything, but we did not." Whether that statement was honesty or an attempt to preserve dignity, no one could know. For many veterans, admitting to weakness was harder than facing death itself. By the end of the campaign, almost 20,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. The survivors carried not just the wounds of battle, but the memory of hunger so deep it stripped them of everything human except shame. On Guadalcanal, the line between man and beast was tested, but not clearly crossed. Perhaps that uncertainty is the truest reflection of desperation's edge. History cannot say for sure what every starving man did in the darkness, but it can say this: hunger made monsters of no one and victims of all. War in the jungle was not clean. It was not glorious or even organized. It was confusion and fear and survival stripped bare. Guadalcanal was only one island in a vast ocean of violence, but it revealed how far men could fall when surrounded by hunger, heat, and death. By late 1942, the battles had turned into something that no longer looked like war. Corpses rotted where they fell. Soldiers of both sides learned to step over the dead without looking down. The smell clung to everything, to clothes, to hands, to memory itself. There were moments of brutality that came not from hatred, but from the madness of exhaustion. Japanese soldiers sometimes used the bodies of the dead for cover in firefights. American troops, hardened by endless ambushes, began to treat corpses as warnings. Some left enemy bodies displayed as proof that no jungle could hide them. Others cut souvenirs from helmets or equipment to send home. These acts were not part of orders. They were the wild logic of men trapped in a place where rules no longer mattered. The line between necessity and cruelty blurred in the mud. On other fronts in the Pacific, cruelty became part of the rhythm of battle. In New Guinea and the Philippines, prisoners were sometimes executed after capture. At Tarawa and Saipan, Marines fought to the last man against soldiers who refused to surrender. Japanese propaganda told them that capture was worse than death, and many believed it completely. Surrender was dishonor, mercy was weakness, and so each side learned to expect no quarter. In that kind of war, even compassion could be mistaken for deceit. Guadalcanal was not exempt from this. The jungle hid ambushes, and every rustle in the leaves might be a trap. Fear made killers out of everyone. There were also stories, whispered and uncertain, of mutilated bodies and missing parts. American reports claimed that Japanese soldiers sometimes desecrated their enemies. Japanese sources accused the same of the Allies. Some of these accounts were real, many were not, but all reflected how war twisted perception. When men live too long among the dead, imagination becomes as dangerous as bullets. The truth is that both sides committed acts they could never explain afterward. Fear, rage, and survival stripped away the thin skin of civilization. By early 1943, when the Japanese evacuation began, the ground around Henderson Field was littered with unburied dead. American bulldozers pushed bodies into shallow graves. The heat made it impossible to bury them all. The air was heavy with decay. For the soldiers who lived through it, Guadalcanal became a memory they could never wash away. They had seen what men could do to one another when trapped between duty and despair. History remembers Guadalcanal as the first major Allied victory in the Pacific, but it was also something darker. It was the place where courage and cruelty lived side by side, where the jungle swallowed not just armies but morality itself. The brutality of that war did not belong to one flag or one nation. It belonged to all who fought there, and its echoes lingered long after the last body was buried beneath the island's restless soil. In Tokyo, the war maps still looked clean. Red and blue lines stretched across the Pacific, neat and orderly, as if the empire's reach could be measured in ink. But by the final days of December 1942, the reports arriving from Guadalcanal told a very different story. Beneath the numbers and coordinates was the truth the generals could no longer ignore. The 17th Army was dying, not in battle, but in hunger. The dream of reclaiming Henderson Field had rotted away, just like the men sent to fight for it. Messages from the island came in shorter and weaker each week. The first reports had been bold and formal, promising victory once reinforcements arrived. By late December, they were almost incoherent. Commanders begged for food, medicine, and boats to carry away the sick. One transmission from Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake described his soldiers as reduced to shadows. Another report warned that only a few thousand men were fit to fight and that those remaining were collapsing from starvation. When Imperial General Headquarters read the message on December 31st, the room fell silent. For the first time, the leadership faced what had once been unthinkable. Guadalcanal was lost. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had once commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, argued that continuing the campaign would waste the Navy's remaining strength. The Army agreed, but hesitated to speak the word retreat. It was not just a military decision, it was a blow to the Empire's pride. Japan had never publicly abandoned a major battlefield, yet the truth was merciless. Of the more than 30,000 soldiers sent to the island, over 20,000 were dead, and the rest were close behind. No number of destroyer runs or drum method deliveries could change that. By the start of the new year, secret meetings in Tokyo settled on a grim new plan. Instead of sending more men to die, they would pull the survivors out. The operation would be disguised as another resupply mission to hide the defeat from both the Americans and the Japanese public. They called it Operation K. The goal was no longer victory but survival. The 17th Army would be ordered to hold its lines just long enough to cover the evacuation. Every man who could still walk would have to make it to the coast under cover of darkness. On Guadalcanal itself, the soldiers did not yet know the decision had been made. They still clung to their positions in the jungle, waiting for supplies that would never come. Some still believed reinforcements were on their way. Others already sensed the truth. The radio messages from Tokyo grew vague, filled with words about honor and endurance instead of promises of help. When the final approval came on December 31st, the commanders in Tokyo sealed the order with trembling hands. The empire that had once conquered half of Asia was now planning its first great withdrawal. On paper, it was a strategic decision. In reality, it was an admission that the mighty Imperial Army had been defeated not by American bullets, but by hunger, disease, and the island itself. The war had turned, and Japan's leaders knew it. From that moment on, Guadalcanal was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. In the dark waters off Guadalcanal, the engines of Japanese destroyers rumbled like ghosts. It was January 14th, 1943, and what looked like another Tokyo Express run was something else entirely. Operation Care had begun. After months of failure, the Imperial Japanese Navy was not bringing food or soldiers. It was coming to take them away. The Empire's first great retreat had started under the cover of night. The Americans watching from the shore did not know it yet. They believed the Japanese were preparing one last desperate attack. But in truth, Japan was already leaving the island it had promised never to abandon. The plan was precise and dangerous. The Navy would send fast destroyers through the slot on 3 separate nights, each one tasked with lifting as many men as possible from the beaches near Cape Esperance. Air cover was impossible. The skies belonged to the Cactus Air Force by day, so everything had to happen after sunset. Each run was a race against time and detection. The sick and the starving were carried to the beaches by their comrades, some barely able to crawl. They waited in silence, the moonlight glinting on the black surface of the sea. The first lift began on January 29th. 17 destroyers slipped through the darkness, their decks stripped of weapons to make room for the living cargo. Signal lamps flickered from ship to ship, guiding them through the reefs. The Japanese called it the transport of the shadows. Over 4,000 men were pulled from the beaches that night, packed so tightly they could not sit down. Many wept as the ships turned north, watching the island shrink behind them. For the soldiers left behind, the silence that followed was unbearable. They did not know if the ships would return. On February 1st, the second wave came. This time, the Americans noticed. Patrol planes spotted destroyers darting along the coast, but Allied commanders assumed they were bringing reinforcements. They ordered attacks on the inland jungle, believing more enemy troops were landing. In reality, the Japanese were vanishing before their eyes. Another 4,000 men were evacuated that night, leaving behind camps filled with the dead and dying. The final lift took place on February 7th. It was the most dangerous. The Americans had increased their patrols and were closing in, but the Japanese destroyers moved faster than expected. In a few frantic hours, the last of the 17th Army that could still stand was pulled from the island. By dawn, the fleet was gone. In total, 10,652 men escaped Guadalcanal. They left behind 20,000 graves and an empire that would never be the same. When the Americans realized what had happened, it was already over. They walked through empty camps and found only skeletons, rusted helmets, and fading letters home. The victory felt hollow. The Japanese had not surrendered. They had simply slipped away into the night. Operation K was one of the most skillful evacuations in military history, but it was born from desperation, not brilliance. For the survivors, the sight of the rising sun on the open sea meant safety, but also shame. They had left their dead behind on an island that had eaten their souls, and as the destroyers vanished into the horizon, so too did the last illusions of Japan's unstoppable empire. When the smoke cleared and the jungle fell silent, the numbers told a story too large for words. More than 31,000 Japanese soldiers had been sent to Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February 1943. Of those, barely 10,000 escaped. The rest, over 20,000 men, were gone. Some died in battle, but most were claimed by hunger, disease, and exhaustion. The island had devoured them. For every man who fell to a bullet, 2 more wasted away under the trees, unseen and uncounted until the war was over. The American victory came at a heavy price too, but the scale of Japan's loss was staggering. Reports gathered after the evacuation described soldiers who weighed less than 100 pounds, their bodies thin as sticks. Many of those rescued during Operation Kerr never recovered. They were carried off the destroyers on stretchers, skin pale and eyes hollow, unable to stand. In hospitals back in Rabaul and Truk, doctors recorded cases of scurvy, malaria, and malnutrition so severe that men could not swallow solid food. Hundreds died even after reaching safety, their organs too damaged to recover. The Japanese army had sent warriors to fight, but it brought back ghosts. For the Americans, the battle was a turning point. They had landed with roughly 11,000 Marines in August 1942 and had fought 6 months of constant struggle against disease, hunger, and a determined enemy. Yet their supply lines held, and their airfield gave them the edge that Japan never regained. In total, around 7,000 Americans were killed or wounded, but they had achieved what no one had done before they had stopped the Japanese advance. Guadalcanal became the first island where Japan retreated instead of conquered. It marked the moment the tide began to turn. When Allied troops explored the abandoned camps after the Japanese withdrawal, they found the evidence of what starvation had done. Rusted rifles lay beside half-empty rice tins. Handwritten notes were pinned to makeshift graves. One diary, recovered near a stream, read, "We do not fear death, but we fear dying slowly." The Marines buried thousands of bodies in shallow pits to stop the spread of disease. Even years later, veterans remembered the sight of bones scattered through the jungle, the remnants of an army destroyed not by gunfire, but by its own supply lines. Historians later calculated the cost with cold precision. Of the 31,358 Japanese who served on Guadalcanal, about 20,700 were dead or missing. That is nearly 2/3 of an entire army. The survivors who returned were too weak to fight again. Japan had lost ships, planes, and men it could not replace, while the United States had proven that determination and logistics could overcome even the fiercest enemy. By the time the last wounded soldier left the hospital ships, the Empire's generals understood what Guadalcanal had revealed. Modern war was not only about bravery or discipline, it was about food, medicine, and fuel. Without them, even the strongest army collapses. On that island of hunger, Japan's myth of invincibility starved to death. The cost was measured not just in numbers, but in the silence that followed when the jungle reclaimed the men who had once believed they could never lose. Long after the guns went quiet, Guadalcanal remained an open wound in memory. For the Americans, it became a symbol of courage, the first proof that the war in the Pacific could be won. For the Japanese, it became a ghost story, whispered with shame and silence. The men who fought there rarely spoke of it, and when they did, their voices carried the weight of hunger more than heroism. What was left behind were fragments of truth and fragments of rumor, and history had to decide which belonged to fact and which belonged to myth. There is no doubt that starvation ruled Guadalcanal. Every record from the time, whether Japanese or American, confirms that disease and hunger destroyed more soldiers than combat ever did. The diaries found in abandoned camps tell the same story in different words: men eating grass, chewing leather, praying for rice that never came. These accounts are not legend. They are the raw evidence of human collapse. Even the Allied soldiers who discovered the camps after the evacuation could not believe what they saw. They found men too weak to raise their heads, living skeletons who had once charged into battle shouting for the emperor. Starvation was not a rumor, it was a certainty. The same cannot be said about cannibalism on Guadalcanal. The idea has followed the island's story for decades, but the proof remains unclear. Unlike later cases in New Guinea or Chichijima, where confessions and trials confirmed the horror, Guadalcanal offers only whispers and speculation. Some American patrols claimed they found signs of human remains used for food, but no photos or formal investigations supported it. Others suggested that isolated acts might have occurred among men driven insane by hunger. Yet in all the surviving Japanese diaries, not one line admits to it. Historians have searched for decades, but the record stays silent. What remains are the limits of evidence and the responsibility to tell only what can be proven. Still, even without those darkest acts confirmed, the story of Guadalcanal stands as one of the most brutal lessons in military history. It showed how an army can die without ever losing a battle. The Japanese soldiers, who landed with pride and confidence, were undone by the simple laws of survival. Without food, without medicine, without supply, courage becomes a curse. Henderson Field and the Cactus Air Force made sure of that. Air control decided who lived and who starved. Every ship sunk, every transport lost, turned another man in the jungle into a corpse. Today the island is quiet again. The rusted shells of tanks and ships lie hidden under vines, and the graves have sunk into the soil. But the lesson still speaks. Victory does not always belong to the bravest or the strongest. It belongs to those who can feed their soldiers, keep them warm, and hold the skies above them. Guadalcanal was more than a battle. It was a warning. In the end, it proved that starvation can break empires faster than bullets, and that even in war, truth must be remembered as carefully as the dead.